9:35, Big 550 KTRS tonight. St. Louis County Library is where our next guest will be for a book signing and a book reading. I love these things because you can really sink your teeth into these great, juicy topics and get a chance to talk to the author. His name is Mark Whitaker, and he's written a new book called Cosby, His Life and Times. Good morning, Mark Whitaker.
Good morning.
This is a you got the help or the what do I want to say? Bill Cosby agreed to this, right?
Well, it took me a year to get any cooperation from him. At first, he wasn't cooperating, but I was pretty persistent. I kept going. I kept reporting, and eventually he came around and he started to talk to me.
And then he turned out to be the nicest guy in the world.
Well, he was very nice, but it was interesting. It was still a challenge, because I've been a reporter for 40 years. And Bill Cosby was unlike any interview I had ever had. I could never schedule anything. He would always call me, usually late at night. And he doesn't answer questions. He tells stories. So my job was to be ready with the questions that would at least elicit the stories that I needed for the book.
He also, just from looking from the outside looking in, I think he's very protective of his image, and he knows very well how to protect it.
Well, that's true, but the advantage I had because I already had been reporting, is that he, apart from saying that he wasn't really going to talk about his personal life, which is something I heard from his representatives, I had to get all of that, and there's a lot of it in the book, but I had to get that from other sources. But I knew a lot by the time he talked to me, and most of the book, even though getting to talk to him was helpful. Most of what I report in the book is from other sources, and a lot of people, including a lot of people very close to Cosby, both professionally and personally, from his childhood, from behind the scenes of his shows, and so forth, who have never talked to anybody else.
Yeah. What was it, Mark Whitaker, about Bill Cosby that you said you wanted to spend years with researching? What was it about Bill Cosby?
Well, I think two things. One is, just in terms of his career, he's been such a pioneer in all these different areas, with his comedy albums, being the first African-American star of primetime television with I Spy, children's television with Fat Albert, commercials. That's even before The Cosby Show, which, was important in so many ways. But also, I wanted to capture his cultural and really historical impact as well, because I think there's a lot to say about that. In fact, Karl Rove, of all people, just after Barack Obama was elected in 2008, was on Fox News saying that he thought The Cosby Show had helped prepare the country 15 years later to elect a black president and to send his family to the White House.
There's no question that there's generations, right? If you're an older, you remember I Spy and some of that, but you also you grew up with Fat Albert, and then you grew up with The Cosby Show. I mean, that was revolutionary. That the number one show in America was about a black middle class family.
No, it was, and it's as I say in the book, and I think anybody who's interested in that show will really be fascinated by the birth of that show, which was very difficult. Nobody expected it to be the success that it was. Sitcoms were considered dead. NBC was in the cellar. It was all thrown together in a matter of months. Cosby insisted in shooting it in New York, in an old silent movie studio here. But I think that I make 2 points about The Cosby Show, in addition to how popular it was. One is, people said at the time that this wasn't really a true black family. In fact, one critic called it Leave It to Beaver and blackface. I talk about all the ways in which, in a very quiet, subtle way, Cosby really was using the show to celebrate black culture, jazz and black art, a historically black college in Hillman, even a spin-off show about life in a black college. But the other thing, which again was what I call quietly radical, was that he completely refused to do sort of standard sitcom-type jokes. He really pushed the writers very hard to make their family, the life of the Huxtables, realistic, and then he figured out ways to make it funny. And in the history of sitcoms, that was actually a real departure from anything that had been done before.
Mark Whitaker, our guest tonight, 7 o'clock, book signing, book reading in St. Louis County, right there on the Frontenac branch of St. Louis County, right there on Lindbergh. The book is called Cosby, His Life and Times. Is it not, Mark Whitaker, a form of racism and or a discrimination to say that Bill Cosby's show wasn't the face of Black America? I mean, that's just offensive on its face, is it not?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think it's silly, but there were people who said it at the time, and the fact is, Cosby throughout his career has been criticized for not bringing race and politics into his comedy and into his television shows. Although, it's interesting because if you read the book, you'll see that he started out modeling himself after Dick Gregory, who was a protest comic in the early 60s. And it was only when he decided that no, he really had to formulate his own voice and have a distinctive style that he went in another direction. But the fact is that although Cosby has been, I don't think he's ignored race, but he's been subtle about it. But I also show that throughout his career, he's been incredibly conscious of what was going on in the outside world. He was a big supporter of civil rights movements. He was even for a while kind of sympathetic, although not a big supporter of some of the Black Power sympathies in the late 70s. He's given millions and millions of dollars to black colleges, and I know that and I write about it in the book that a lot of the views that he's expressed recently about certain behavior in the black community has been controversial, but say what you will about it, and it can be debated, he has not only talked the talk, he's walked the walk by going into black communities to talk to young people about being good parents, to talk to kids about staying in school. So he's backed it up.
Yeah, it's also, and not to get too race here, but I mean, I think it's such an important point that Cosby show and his stand-up act and the way he carried himself and his material, not only did it show the black community a certain way, but it also showed the white community that African Americans are, quote unquote, like everybody else. Like there can be a doctor and a lawyer, and their kids can be just normal and have normal problems and live just like everybody else.
No, and it was always very important to Cosby, and he talked to me about it, and I also have him talking throughout his career. He did not want to portray black people as either being buffoons or clowns, which had been, unfortunately, a long tradition of that, or as victims. And his problem, and it's not that he's unaware of, what they call institutional racism, but he feels, first of all, that you can wait for a long time for the system to change, or you can take control of things that, in your own life. But also that it's psychologically undermining to view yourself as a victim. So he always wanted to portray black folks in a way that didn't make them look like they were somehow victims of the system.
I didn't watch every single episode of The Cosby Show, but I can't remember one instance where racism ever was a topic at all.
Well, they did at the very end, partly because he had, gotten such an earful from so many people about it. And actually, at the urging of Alvin Poussin, who was an African-American psychiatrist at Harvard who was an advisor to the show, in the last couple of seasons, they introduced a character, a cousin Pam, who came from less well-off circumstances. And through her character, there were a few episodes in the last few seasons where, she encounters some racism and protests against discriminatory pricing in inner city communities and so forth. But, it's still, it was done with a light touch and not a heavy hand.
Mark Whitaker, our guest. The book is called Cosby, His Life and Times tonight, 7 o'clock book signing and a book reading. Mark, before we go, you talked to him about his son.
Yes.
Who was murdered.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I did. And although, again, he wasn't really, I got most of that from other sources, including the woman who broke the news to him, the producer, and people who were with him the day of the death and at the burial. Ennis Cosby, the apple of his eye, his only son, very admirable kid who had had dyslexia, been diagnosed, turned his life around, was on his way to a doctorate at Columbia when he was murdered out in L.A. Randomly. And, I think you will see in reading the book not only the story of how he died, but what he meant to Bill Cosby and how that affected him and continues to affect him to this day. And it's also a reminder, we think of Bill Cosby as being so successful and so rich and so forth, but that, tragedies, in this case, one of the worst tragedies can happen to anybody, happen even to, the most powerful. And in the end, I think the story in this book, not only of his successes, but also his professional setbacks and some of his personal struggles, I think makes this story almost kind of Shakespearean and one that I think everybody can relate to.
His car broke down, right? And he was on the side of the road changing a tire or something?
Yeah, that's right. And there was ultimately, the man who was convicted and sent to prison and probably would have, might have been, sentenced to death, except the Cosbys, said that they didn't believe in the death penalty. Turned out to be a young 19-year-old Ukrainian immigrant, a delinquent, but he's behind bars for the rest of his life now.
Mark Whitaker, the book is called Cosby, His Life and Times. There was a lot of meat on the bone, and I'm sure you got a lot of it. Tonight, you're going to be at the St. Louis County Library for a book signing and a book reading. Mark, have a safe trip to St. Louis, and good luck with the book.
Great. Thanks for having me.
You got it. 747, Big 550, KT.